Thank you for joining us it's still morning here in the Pacific Coast, and happy afternoon to everyone joining us from other time zones or other parts of the world. Today, our topic is really exciting. It's all about how consumers are solving each of the key day parts, as well as those special occasions that come up. And why we picked this topic is because we've found, as we've come together as one Circana, understanding how people eat meals, cook meals, use appliances in their house to solve their meal needs is as important as looking at price and share and the tracking mechanisms we've gotten so used to in food and beverage. Looking at it holistically from a different side of the coin really does open up new opportunities. So I'm Jonna Parker. I'm the Vice President and Team Lead for our Fresh Foods practice here. However, today we are going to be talking about total food and beverage and thinking about it in the lens of meal occasion. So this isn't a fresh update. This is a total food and beverage update. And I'm so excited to be joined truly by one of my favorite people in the firm, Darren Cipher. Said that right this time? Excellent.
I'm Darren Cipher. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Darren and I have really interesting chats as two different, people from across different parts of the food and beverage world. And really the goal of today is the kind of chats we have and share as two thought leaders at Circana. We'll be sharing some of those insights with you. Quick housekeeping as I put this slide up, which is the scope of what we'll be talking about today and the types of information. So we're going to go across retail, consumption, and food service data. Here at Circana, for the first time really in history, from a food and beverage standpoint, we can see across all three spaces, and that's the data we'll be sharing with you today. Quick housekeeping, this will be recorded and the presentation will be available on our On24 webinar suite software. Attendees who've registered for this event will be receiving a link to download the deck as well as view this recording within typically 24 hours to 48 hours of the presentation. So yes, it will be recorded. Yes, you will get to download the slides. In addition, if you have questions for Darren and I today, please go into the chat box called Q&A on your right-hand side of the screen. We can answer those live as it's going in the system software. So please don't wait for the end to ask questions. We have a packed agenda, and so we really want to make sure you have the opportunity to ask your questions using the software. So let's jump into today's topic. We're going to be talking first about what is life like year to date for consumers. I'll cover that section and give you all the meaty details about how food and beverage categories are trending, how we're shopping today here in the US, and how that's changed in the last 5 years. I'll then turn it over to Darren, who's going to go through each of our day parts and look at how we're solving meals in America. And then we'll wrap up each section with our considerations and recommendations for growth. Again, if at any point you have a question, please feel free to go in the Q&A box. And also, Circana has many, many experts well beyond Darren and myself. And so if you have any questions that we can't answer today, please feel free to go ahead and ask your Circana contact, or we put an email address in there, and we also have some LinkedIn links at the end. So let's jump into the current consumer marketplace. First off, this slide format first appeared in our excellent snacking webinar that was last April. But I think it's so important to do as a one-slide summary of the journey that we've all been on, because we're consumers too, right? As we've embarked on the last kind of 4 years so far of this decade. There are stoplights and considerations as you think about what to buy in food and beverage. And we said this is retail, but it's actually true in food service as well. You've got to consider the fact that yes, price for food and beverage is statistically 30+% higher than we paid pre-pandemic. There's therefore a lot of thoughts about what is real, what is worth it, right? And what really should I put on my plate or in my pantry or in my refrigerator. You've also got the fact that, as you well know and is well covered in the economic press, various costs and revenue inputs like wage growth have not kept pace with the rate of inflation. Now, that said, we as a US economy are still doing quite strong. The recession that many expected to come didn't statistically come. But that hasn't changed the fact that as you go through this literal roadmap of feeding yourself and your family, there's a whole lot of different things you have to consider, even things like weight loss drugs that have completely changed the way that we think about feeding ourselves and what it means in that wellness to weight and eating benefit ratio. Ultimately, as we're sitting here in the end of 23, we ended the year with 6% dollar growth and negative 1% volume unit growth. You'll see in a minute, we have technically started to see positive or flat unit and volume growth, but we're lapping an already down volume unit scenario. Also, in the full detail of the deck that you will download, you'll see that when we compare food and beverage from a dollar and unit growth standpoint to other consumer spending sectors, we're actually not the top growth situation, or we're not the top growth category. And I did just want to mention that I noted that there is some questions coming in about audio in the chat. So I'm going to ask our webinar master on the phone to see if they can go ahead and rectify that. I appreciate that. And I will note we are recording this. So if you're unable to hear live, please know that it is being recorded. So that was the past and very, very current present. But what is, through June 2024, the pulse of American consumers? What we found is that inflation concerns and food cost is still 94% of Americans' consideration. With that in mind, consumers are perceiving that prices are continuing to go up. Yet, we have seen that average retail prices are starting to kind of flatline, so to speak, but perception is reality. And especially with certain pockets of the population, in particular rural versus urban or suburban areas, larger households with many mouths to feed, and most interestingly, the millennial cohort, consumers under age 40, are most concerned about food cost inflation as of June 24. Now, we know and have tracked for many months now that people are making changes due to the perceived and actual inflation costs at grocery shelving. The biggest cohort of groups that are most concerned now are our younger consumers. 88% of consumers aged 33 and below are very much cognizant of and concerned about making changes. We have an upcoming Top Trends and Fresh all about how we have to better understand how younger consumers are making purchases. Because here's the reality. Even though, yes, millennials and Gen Z are not nearly the dollar impact today that boomers and Gen X are, they are making habits and decisions about putting food on their plate and in their houses that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. So the fact that this youngest cohort is the most concerned and changing behavior due to price really is long systemic impact to our industry. The biggest impact that we've seen in terms of how we change how we shop and eat, given this cost inflation, has been in the number of trips we make. So I've used this phrase quite a bit, as have other of my colleagues. It's really much a just-in-time shopping culture today. So, for example, as of the 6/16 data ending period, literally 2 weeks ago, we're seeing the average American household make 216 trips to any store for food and beverage. This is an all-time high rate in our tracking services in terms of the number of trips we're making. It's actually quite a lot more trips than we were making, certainly during the pandemic, but even in the last couple of years. Center store is seeing the most increase in trips. And deli and the fresh departments are also seeing a phenomenal increase in trips. Now, deli has repositioned itself as a place to get ready to make meals and solutions that you're taking home. Darren's going to talk a lot about the role of heat and eat, but that's what's driving deli. It's not people waiting at service counters. It's finding solutions that help them feed their family in an affordable way. And the deli, in many parts of retail, is seen as a trade down from a food service meal. We also see that there's an uneven use of different foods in the trip and even the sales, as you'll see in a minute. So produce, for example, is seeing tremendous frequency increase, whereas meat and seafood are seeing lower trip increase. But as we'll talk about today, the root of that is less about the product itself, it's the positioning in the meal and the fact that meat and seafood, when you go and purchase from those departments, it's a big ring. Right? You got to make sure you're using, when you buy $6.99 chicken breast or, spend $10 on a steak, you want to use what you're having. So just-in-time shopping really meets the need of the inflation moment because consumers are thinking, hey, I don't want to waste and throw this out. So our shopping behavior is very much tied to this inflationary moment. Now, when we look at department specific performance, it's an uneven game. Yes, when we look at dollars in sales, some departments are growing faster than another. So, of course, that's what I mean by uneven. However, when we add in metrics like volume, you really start to see the unevenness. So, certain departments are seeing now through the latest 52 weeks ending June 2024, some departments have returned to volume growth. Now, what gets even more interesting is, of course, a statistician who's not a consumer would say, well, price is the driver of volume. And certainly there are numerous examples in food and beverage where items are being driven up or down in volume by price. But the reality is we're also not seeing price increases anymore across food and beverage. They're all going up at the same amount. We're also not seeing price per volume or unit increases that are purely tied to the same item getting inflation. Things like different package sizes, different foods hitting the marketplace. Beverages has been fascinating with the way that category has played a different role for consumers. And that is what's driving it as much as its price. So I'm not here to tell you that you shouldn't consider price inflation in your decisions. What we are going to talk about today, though, is in addition to pricing analytics, which are absolutely what the moment needs, we also need to consider the role and the part of the day and really the solution and the occasion that that food fits in, because it is an equally important factor to growth. So when it comes to actual products, where are we seeing dollars continue to rise in a meaningful way? This is a quick list across all of food and beverages of absolute dollar change growth through June of 2024 versus 23 of the same period. You see immediately that those pink boxes are not all at the same level. So dollar growth certainly doesn't also mean unit volume growth, because not just of the price, but the role again that an item plays. We see that beef is the top dollar absolute growth category for the entire food and beverage space. Now, pound volume is relatively flat, but as we'll talk a lot about today, we've changed how we've done dinner, and it's actually more in the role and the way that beef, which has steaks and roasts and grinds and ingredients, really does meet the moment of dinner, is part of why it's winning. Now you look at a category like energy drinks, bottled water, and even yogurt. There's been a lot of new entrants that change the way that that item is seen by a consumer in their daily life. And you start to see more of that higher volume growth in addition to smart choices in pricing and packaging. Further, I don't want to overarchingly not speak about deli prepared meats. As somebody who speaks on fresh throughout my career, the fact that our common fruits, which are apples, bananas, grapes, those fresh common fruits are meeting a moment of consumers needing snacking and easy solutions, and fresh common fruit really being a price relevant and situationally relevant opportunity. But I'll tell you, within fresh common fruit, not all 5 of those varieties are growing up equally. We're still doing a lot of trade-offs in the way we strategically think about these categories versus thinking about growing consumption, sales, and volume overall. So that's really our purpose today, is we can report deeper on any of these numbers. We go very deep in our retail tracking services. But today we want to talk about how people eat, because it is really the key when you start to think about these categories of why they are growing the way they're growing. So ultimately, we wrote some really detailed pieces over the last 3 years on the role of inflation and consumer temperature. But it all comes down to thinking beyond value more than price. And we've talked extensively about this, so I'm not going to drain this slide. We have a great white paper up on Circana.com that goes into deep detail on each of these 4 factors. But I love talking about this with my clients because we as an industry in food, we think a lot about convenience and quality, right? We have for 2 decades. Convenience and quality have always sit at the top of a pyramid of consumer decisions about food. Quality, though, can't just be we're the freshest or, hey, our stuff tastes great, because there's so many items out there now competing for our mouths and stomachs in pantries and refrigerators. You have to be uniquely relevant in quality. Similarly, Darren's going to talk about the role of convenience and how people solve the meal today. Just cutting something up or packaging it different, you shouldn't high five that you've hit that convenience box. Convenience must be in the eye of the consumer. And that is really what our occasion data is going to talk about today. Now, you'll also hear us throughout today talk about relevance and experience, those little things that are so big to consumers. For almost any item that people ask me about this year, and Darren, I know you've said the same, it actually does come down to, is the right audience for that product find it incredibly relevant? And frankly, even on a niche audience, if you're relevant, you're still making it in the basket or on the ticket when you go out to food service, if you're relevant to that audience in a really meaningful way. We're also going to talk a lot today about experience, because if someone is shopping or eating or dining and they don't quite know if they're going to like or be able to make what they're buying, guess what? They're not going to buy it. They're not going to order it. They're not going to frequent those spaces because they may love sushi. But if they don't know how to replicate that at home or know the best place to buy that product out at restaurants, they're not going to waste the money in today's environment on that if they don't feel qualified that the experience will meet the expectation. So those dimensions of value we continue to see be really what's important. There's one more factor we're going to take a brief side story on because it's the elephant in the room, and we'd be remiss to talk about American consumers without recognizing that we're in a period that's very pivotal, right? We've been on a roller coaster of COVID, then inflation, and in and out of various economic challenges in the first 4 years of this decade. But we're also sitting at the middle of a decade at a precipice. There is three monumental, no one would argue more, but we tried to simplify for today, three monumental differences in America that this moment has to recognize. First off, partly due to COVID and partly just due to where we're at in terms of travel and connectivity and working from home and, all of those pieces, we have seen a population migration in this country from historic areas like the Northeast and the Midwest to the South and the Southwest. I know we're showing Southeast here, but it does obviously extend into the West. We're also seeing a multicultural and specifically with Hispanic population growth, but the Hispanic population is incredibly diverse. They're different races. They're from different countries of origin. The other big piece is the younger generation does have emerging spending power. And the most important thing about right now with that is they're setting their patterns today. So 20 years from now, people who were in their teens and 20s are going to remember that there was COVID, then really high inflation when they explain to the future generation why they do what they do, the same way we talk as Gen Xers and Boomers about the other things that rocked our worlds in our lifetimes. So I'm just going to do a quick slide through about just give you a little bit of points of what I mean by that dig site. This is a quick look at how we've seen buyers, the decision maker, primary grocery decision, food and beverage decision maker, how those buyers have shifted in the last few years. Now, we're not currently seeing a direct correlation between buyers shifting and sales dollar volume impact in terms of a direct correlation that the more buyers, the more growth. But there is some correlation in directional trend. And again, you see that it's that Southeast and that Western that have picked up a lot of buying households. And therefore, they're taking with them things and beliefs that are fundamentally shaping those regionals differently. Further, this is a great slide to read. I'm not going to drain it to present to it, but I personally took a few minutes to just pull all of our shopping behavior data by ethnicity and race and across. I was floored by how much, even at the total food and beverage level, we're seeing pockets of potential that are not being met in each of these groups. So thinking about the fact that we have more multi-ethnic households than we ever have in the history of time. Almost 10% just versus 2 years ago are people who identify as other, meaning their household or personal race and ethnicity is a blend. The hair care industry has done an amazing job of meeting these mixed and multi-ethnic household needs. Where's the food options for that? Further, of course, we have to talk about the growth in Hispanic spending, which is sizable. But I found it really interesting that on the other side of the coin, Asian populations are making less trips when, frankly, everyone's making more trips. What is the Asian population, which, by the way, is both Southeast Asian as well as, traditional Asian from Japan or China? Those groups, why aren't they going to the stores as much and buying food and beverage? We also have already seen that there has been a disproportionate amount of new buyers who are not Caucasian. So meeting this moment means better understanding ethnicities. And last but not least, in this side story about, we're going to talk about averages, but you got to consider your food's relevance across ethnicities and regions. And with this slide, generations. I am not going to drain this slide. The data speaks for itself. Yes, dollars are concentrated in people who were born 1980 or after, and it's heavily concentrated in people who were born between 1965 and 1980 and 1964. But guess what? All of those households are getting older, they're shrinking in size, and we have to look to millennials and Gen Z and meet them in the moment that we're having. So, to wrap up the current consumer market, inflation is coloring all choices. Value is not as simple as price equals up or down volume. We have to really consider experience and relevance with every category. Whether you're a staple or an emerging behavior, your relevance to your driver audience will really show your future. And as we get into the future, we've got to consider different shoppers. But with that, the whole purpose of this that Darren and I wanted is to talk about how we cook and eat. Because we feel strongly at Circana that if you understand how you cook and eat and you look at then your sales, your shopping, your food service sales, you will have a better path to growth, whatever food you're trying to sell. With that, I'll turn it over to Darren.
Thank you, Jonna, for that great setup. So, Jonna talked about some key points here. She mentioned about how prices at retail are now 30% higher than they were the pre-pandemic period. And yeah, those prices just continued to go up after the pandemic. And it seemed as though it was just unstoppable, that the more the prices went up, the more people were just spending on food and beverage. And I think we have hit an inflection point. And I'll show you what I mean in terms of restaurant traffic. And that's probably going to bode still well for the retail side of things, because it is still less expensive to get your foods and beverages from retail, especially when we're not going to be going out to restaurants quite as much. So what I wanted to share with you first is about the relationship between in-home and away from home meals. So you've probably heard this number a bit, about 86% of our meals coming from home. I will tell you that I have looked at some preliminary data for the just 2024. So this is looking at a year ending in March of 2024. We look at just the first few months of this year, you're starting to see that inch back toward the home. And that's kind of telling. I'll show you what that means in terms of restaurant traffic. But anyway, let's just go back into what we're seeing for now in terms of the different day parts. So how much we rely on the home fluctuates as we go through the day. And that's how we're going to structure this section, is how people are starting their day, how they go through the middle of their day, and how they end their day. And then we'll actually talk about some special occasions, because humans are not monolithic beings. We're not binary beings in terms of our thought processes. So we kind of shift away from everything once in a while. And that's why these special occasions are going to be important to us. So when we start off our days, we're more likely to have our meals from home compared to some of these other day parts. Lunch is the time when we are most likely to source a meal away from home. We're most likely out of our home. We're most likely at a workplace environment. It's just we're dressed and ready to go, even if we are working from home. So it's more likely that we could be out of the home during that day part. And then it kind of comes back up a little bit at dinner time. So this is just a basic dynamic around how much we rely on retail source foods from the home. But what I wanted to show you, though, is what we've been tracking in terms of traffic to restaurants. And I'm going into that left-hand side chart right now. That's traffic change versus the prior year. So 2023 actually started off pretty well. We saw that first quarter had about a 2% increase in restaurant traffic, flattened out, but it looked like we were still going to be above the prior year levels. Then in that Q4 period, we started to see some receding of traffic. And in Q1 of this year, we saw that come down to about 2%. And actually, if you continue to look at months after Q1 of this year, we're seeing that decline even more. It's approaching 3% for the year. So a lot of that is actually because we've noted that some of the higher income consumers have started to pull back. There's one group of consumers that consistently increased their traffic visits since the pandemic, and that was households making $200,000 or more a year, consistently every year until now. So if that group, the wealthiest among us, are saying, I need to pull back on my restaurant usage, that's a sign. I think that's a bellwether for how American consumers feel in terms of their comfort, in terms of going out. Now, we're not abandoning restaurants. We're not saying, forget that, we're never going to do this anymore. But we're finding different uses for them. And maybe they're finding smaller pockets of usage for them than they had in the past. And really where we saw that decrease happen was that morning day part. Now, last year, when we saw that Q1 increase, a lot of that was driven by morning traffic. So people grabbing their cup of coffee and getting a snack, even maybe a breakfast sandwich on the way to work. The movement towards work has slowed a bit more. It hasn't really come down, but we have seen that increase towards people going back to offices has slowed down a little bit. So that's part of that. But again, at the same time, we're still seeing more and more people kind of say, maybe I'm going to carry this morning meal to work, or maybe just going to not go to the restaurant the way that we were doing in the past. There are some bright spots in this. We did see in the morning time there is some snacking going on, and that's kind of what I was talking about, that maybe consumers aren't quite going out for the entire meal, but they're going for something a little bit more affordable, like a smaller snack time item that kind of fits into a budget better than getting the entire meal. So as consumers are pulling back from restaurants, what are the things that we're seeing kind of in terms of the foods and beverages that they're increasing and decreasing? So there are still winners even in declining environments. And when we look at the things that are increasing in servings, so that's the number of times that a consumer got that from the food service operator, you do see some snack-oriented items here. You see some salty snacks are among the things here. You see the chicken wings, the chicken strips, things that you could probably snack on, maybe not have the entire chicken breast, but you could have things that you could just munch on. So that's again, thinking about how consumers are sensibly indulging when they go away from home, maybe not getting that entire meal. Now on the declining side, that's very reflective of where the traffic is pulling back from. So, the biggest source of traffic are our QSR burger restaurants. And as they stop going to these restaurants as often, it's no surprise that you see things like French fries. You can see pizza. That was actually more of a longer term thing, but the burgers are up there as well. So again, those are the things that people are starting to pull back from as they're starting to say, hey, maybe this increase in prices across the board for food, I need to get it in control. And these are the ways that consumers are getting it under control. So as they go back into home for more meals, one of the things that we've noted that they've been doing is they've been using more and more heat and eat solutions. Now, Jana kind of alluded to this. Some examples would be things that you get at the deli counter at the grocery store. So something that was pre-seasoned, you just need to put it into the oven and there is your meal. It could be a frozen item. So basically, as it sounds, you put it in the microwave, you put it in the oven, and then you ate it. So it takes a lot of time out of the preparation for the consumer. And in many cases, especially for going from the deli counter, we can be recreating that restaurant experience that consumers have been looking for. It also helps consumers across the day in different ways. So when are we most likely to do this? Things like lunch and dinner time are the most likely times that we're going to do this. Breakfast, the number one item that we have at breakfast is cold cereals. That's probably why Heat and Eat isn't doing as hot as it is at the other day parts. But it still is important when we think about things like breakfast sandwiches and some other things like instant oatmeal, things that help consumers get out the door very quickly. Snacking occasions are very much about just ready to eat and opening up packages. So that's not really going to be about Heat and Eat. But thinking about when consumers are coming home from work now, back in 2020, we didn't really have to allocate time to make meals because we were commuting. We had the time to make complex meals back then. And well, that's kind of gone away, right? So even though we're going back into the home like we were in 2020, we don't have the time that we did in 2020. That is the key difference between what we're seeing as people go back into the home. So Heat and Eat solutions are helping consumers solve for that time crunch that they're experiencing right now. All right, so that was kind of overarching. Let's go a little bit more specific into the breakfast occasion. And so, as we already said, about 87% of the time, the meal is sourced from home. Now, I want to make sure people are clear on this. Sourced from home does not necessarily mean that they ate it in the home. So, when we're running out of the home in the morning, it's very likely that people will have water bottles, they have their coffee mugs, they'll take a bar or something that's portable so they can eat while they're commuting or while they're on the road. I always like to say to meet these consumers' needs, you have to just think of them as one-handed, because one hand is going to be holding a steering wheel or it's going to be holding a smartphone while you're commuting. Okay. So we need to find ways that people could just use that in that one hand. You've got to be that perfect solution for that one extra hand that they have. And when we go away from home, I think this is clearly demonstrating about the convenience factor as well. The vast majority of the time, we're not staying in the restaurant. So there too, consumers are looking for that one-handed item to help them get along their way and where they need to be in the morning. So speed and convenience are very, very important to consumers at this day part. And in fact, when we ask consumers about what motivated this meal, we can see that convenience and routine are very big motivators at this day part. So we see convenience is a little over 30%, just routine, I just do this all the time, that's about another 25%. That drives more than half of breakfast occasions right there. So if we're not talking to consumers about how this is going to solve a problem like time, or how this is going to fit into the things that you just do every morning as part of your routine, you're probably missing out a bit on this day part, right? Now, you might have something that's very health oriented, and yes, that is more prominent in the morning, but as consumers go throughout the day, that squeezes down a little bit. So if that's your only message, then you're still missing out on how you could be helping consumers throughout the day. So even when we look at what is convenient and what is a routine, there are different categories that come up to the top. And we highlighted here in orange, these are things that are either fresh or things that are baked. So I just wanted to see that it's not just about things that are packaged that help solve the needs for convenience. There are also opportunities in the fresh world that help consumers with this as well. But again, look at how the categories come up a little differently. So you could have one product that goes across both of these. It's important to know how your products relate to these different motivations, but you should be speaking to more than one motivation if that's possible. So we have things like bars and bagels that are part of convenience, because think about it, they could be held with one hand and people could move about with them. When you're going about routine, this is just what I do. I wake up in the morning, I have a cup of coffee. That is very much about what I just do all the time. And so those are categories where you need to think about, how do I get into that routine, right? How do I get into that? The convenience side is more about solving problems, right? I have to get out of the door quickly. That is a problem that needs to be solved. And that's upon us to help consumers do that every single day. So that's breakfast. So as we move across the day, look at how these needs change a little bit more. So we see that convenience comes at a bigger piece of the pie as we go towards that afternoon day part. And I should add that this did not shift when COVID came upon us and a lot of people were working from home. It's not like, since people were close to their kitchens during lunchtime, that they all of a sudden were bringing up the pans and greasing them up and making these bigger meals. No, the midday meal is still about convenience because we're still busy during that time of day, regardless of where we are. So if we're at home, going to the office, it doesn't matter. Consumers need something that are very quick for them during this day part. Routine comes down a little bit. Health isn't quite as there. And you'll notice that as we go through the day, health comes down, right? So that morning day part is really about health, and that kind of slides away as the day goes on. And I'll talk about snacking that happens during that day part as well. So let's look at how our occasions at the midday meal have shifted over time. So this is looking at the annual number of occasions that consumers sourced their lunches from retail, that's that top line. And the bottom one is how often they sourced it from food service, right? So there's that 76% I was talking about, 76% is from retail. Now look at what happened. So we saw as the pandemic came upon us, that came down, but then it was slowly recovering. until this year. We're starting to see that come back down again. And again, that doesn't mean that because people are not going away from their homes. It's we're seeing more of this carried. People are carrying their meals from home a bit more often. They're taking leftovers to the office. They're trying to find ways to cut down on having to spend more money at those restaurants because they're starting to kind of feel the pinch now. Like I said, even those high income consumers are saying, maybe this isn't such the value for me to go away from home anymore. I should also be taking more of my meals from home as well. Okay. So this doesn't mean consumers aren't on the move. They absolutely are. But we need to find ways to get consumers a bit more convenience and help them with that value equation. So make sure that their spend is also meeting what they're expecting. Now, in terms of the form of foods that people have, it's because convenience is such a high factor this day part. More than 80% of the time, they're looking for something that's ready to eat. Okay, so they just don't have a lot of time to handle these meals. There is a substantial part here that is also completely homemade, but that is driven by sandwiches. And you know, the last time you made a sandwich, it probably only took about 5 minutes to make. And so that is why we're seeing such a big part in terms of completely homemade, but it's really more about that quick sandwich. Consumers really only allocate 5 minutes to making their lunch meal. And you have to think about, if I'm going to help consumers solve for this day part, that's the window that you have to work in, right? So even though they might not be moving, they might still be in the office, they might even be at home. 5 minutes is all that you have to work with for the vast majority of these meals. All right, and that's also why we've seen heat and eat grow at this day part as well. Back in 2019, that number for heat and eat was 27%. Okay, so we're continuing to see consumers gravitate towards these solutions that help them out. And if you're wondering, by the way, if why this doesn't add up to 100%, it's because you can have multiple items at the same meal. So just wanted to make sure we are all clear on that one as well. I think what's also interesting to look at is what are the foods that are growing at this day part. It is also very reflective of the need for speed and convenience. So thinking about fruit, thinking about how easy it is for a banana to just grab it and put it into your work bag. It's usually very clean. It doesn't make a mess unless you kind of smash it a little too hard in your bag, but otherwise it's going to survive the trip. And it's a convenient way for you to have that afternoon snack. Global cuisine, you know, Jana mentioned about our rapidly changing makeup of our demographics, and we're seeing multicultural aspects come in, especially with our younger generations. And a lot of that global cuisine comes in the form of frozen items, you know, because a lot of times we just don't know how to make that at home. But those solutions, they do a few things for us. They give us variety. They give us things that we probably won't have on a normal basis. And not to mention, you could do it in less than 5 minutes with the microwave oven. So another way is just other ways that we're seeing this being expressed. Now, on the declining side, you see things related to sandwiches, you see soup. I don't want anyone to look at this and say, uh-oh, sandwiches, or people are done with sandwiches. This is still the top thing that we have at lunchtime. And I've been, in terms of our legacy companies, I've been with NPD for over 17 years. I haven't seen sandwiches come off the #1 spot at lunchtime. So I don't think it's going to happen in any of our lifetimes, but just know that there's always a bunch of Davids chipping away at the Goliath. And that's what's going on here. So that's why we're seeing things like fruit and global cuisine come into the fray a little bit more. Now, focusing on what's going on in QSR lunchtime. Again, QSR is where most of restaurant traffic happens. So that's why I'm focusing here again. And I think it's interesting when you look at the things that are actually growing in servings at lunchtime. It's also reflective of what I was talking about earlier about how consumers might be looking for more snackable items from food service. Whereas on the right-hand side there, again, we're seeing the burgers and fries come down a little bit more. So things like soup and the side salads, so those smaller dishes, cookies even. You know, I don't like to mention company names because I don't want to seem like I am in favor of one versus another, but there is a particular cookie operator that has been the fastest growing operator in the US. And, you know, they make cookies. That is not something that is new. That's not something that's unusual to consumers, but it's their own twist on it. And it's something that maybe it's a different experience that you would get from what you could get at retail. And it's just a big reason why this company has been growing so much. They're giving consumers that afternoon break. It's affordable, it's an indulgence, and it's something that's a little bit different. And I think that right now is part of the key to success at getting consumers back into food service. Now, I want to talk a bit about what's going on at the snacking occasions. I'm doing it here in the middle of the day because that is a peak time when consumers typically have snacking occasions. And so when I'm looking at the top here, this is the annual number of occasions per person in this country who have a main meal, so breakfast, lunch, or dinner. That's barely budged, right? And I think it's also evidence to say, because we were hearing from a lot of people, like, are people eating less? Are they not having as many meals? Because we saw volumes coming down at retail for a bit. Nope, people are not skipping out on their meals. In fact, if you look at the next line, that is the number of between main meal occasions, so snacking occasions. That has continuously increased over the same period of time. So in total, we're having slightly more meals thanks to the snacking occasions over time. Now, one of the things that's a little bit unique about snacking versus some of these main meals is that there isn't necessarily a prescribed time to have these snacking occasions. So when we look at the breakfast line, you can see it's a very distinct bell curve for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and it's a very narrow bell. We typically have that breakfast around 8, lunch at noon, dinner around 6. But look at the yellow area. That is our between main meal occasions. And so, while not as high, you don't see the fluctuation as much, which means people are more likely to snack at any given time throughout the day. And as we just saw, it was about 800 plus times per year that the average consumer has a snacking occasion. That's 2+ times a day that the consumer could have it. And again, it's not prescribed to any one time of day, which makes it easier for consumers to just add another snacking occasion throughout the day. I always talk about main meals as being something that's a zero-sum game. You might have a great new product out there, but people aren't going to have an additional main meal occasion just because you have this product out here. But snacking allows them to do that a little bit more. And in terms of food service, and I think this is, again, proof of what I've been saying all along, this is looking at total traffic to commercial restaurants versus the total snacking occasions at commercial restaurants. And you might look at that -1 and say, well, why are you talking to me about this? Well, anything approaching 0 right now in terms of traffic at restaurants is a win, right? We used to say 0 is up. And so that is closer to 0 than total restaurant traffic that we've seen here. The QSR bakery is actually a big part of that. But again, it is really about consumers looking for that reasonable escape throughout the day. And this could happen in the afternoon. This could be happening in the evening. It could be late night for those operators that are open that late. So this is, again, it's not about that afternoon rush. It's something that could happen throughout any part of the day for consumers looking for that break that they might need at any point during the day. Now, we're starting to come towards the end of the day now, right? So we've had our breakfast, we've had our lunches, maybe had a snack. We're getting back into the home, and we're wondering about what drives these motivations. Cravings are pretty high at this time of day, right? Because we started our day off right. Health motivations were pretty high. You can see here they're at their lowest in terms of main meals. We might have had a long day, and I just want to get something satiated in my body. Because of that, we tend to allow a little bit more time to make our dinners. We have on average about 30 minutes that people allow to prepare their dinners, right? So we went from 5 minutes at lunch, now we got 30 minutes to satisfy their cravings, right? But not much more, right? And that does fluctuate throughout the week. Monday through Thursday, that's about 30 minutes. Fridays, people they're done. That's when they're more likely to go out for dinner. Saturday and Sunday, they'll allocate a little more time because they have the time. But for most days of the week, consumers are just going to give you 30 minutes to solve that problem. And that is a problem that we do need to solve, is what is for dinner. Now, what are the things that we are most likely to have in terms of a main dish, and what's growing fastest at dinner time? Now, poultry is up here. It's been the #1 spot for quite a while. It is the least expensive, or one of the least expensive proteins that people could get compared to, say, like beef or some pork items here. But those red meat items are still up here pretty high. Global cuisine, that was a fast mover at lunchtime. It is now #2 and also the second fastest growing item at dinner time. So once again, reflective of our multicultural makeup of our population. And I think it says to you, we need to look outside of our borders for innovation ideas, that it's okay to step aside from meat and potatoes and vegetables, the Trinity. It's okay to look outside and find new ideas because we know that consumers are looking for these different ways of consuming. And so looking from South America, Europe, looking into Asia as ways for innovation for flavors and spices and seasonings, those are all fair game. And based upon these trends, it should be a pretty good deal for you. I think consumers might grab onto it. So thinking about that as ways that we could make more solutions for consumers. Now, what are the challenges that consumers are expressing to us? And really what this is about is, again, when consumers thinking about what is for dinner, they're not thinking about components. They're thinking about what is that finished product. That is the solution that they're looking for. The problems or challenges that people have is getting some of those new ideas for themselves. Is how do I make something different instead of making the same thing over and over again? Same thing with planning that meal. How could we plug into this? It could be a matter of having a solution in terms of a food and beverage product, but we could also think about how do we help them organize their week. That's fair game. That's all part of this path to consumption that we talk about. It's not just about having a food or a beverage. It's answering questions like, here's here's a resource that you have that could give you recipe ideas. Here's I'm just going to make this up, a spreadsheet with macros and formulas that help them have different things throughout the day. Or AI is now big. Can we use AI to help them say, I've got all these things in my refrigerator. Here's what you could actually now make with it. That's a solution that consumers are looking for. And if you could help them do that in less time, that's also what they're looking for as well, because almost a third of consumers are saying that they just don't have the time to prepare these meals. So thinking about all the challenges that consumers have at dinner time, there are so many different ways that we could plug in and help them solve for some of these issues. Now, what are some of the appliances that consumers are using to solve for this? Well, these went through a pretty interesting ebb and flow during the pandemic till now. During the pandemic, we saw some of these newer appliances make their way to the top at dinner time, but they've since receded. The only exception that we've seen is the air fryer, and that's that fourth item there. It continues to grow at dinner time, despite the fact that the sales are a little bit soft. We continue to see more usage of these items. I just looked in terms of what percent of homes have it. It's about 2/3 of homes now have an air fryer in it. And by the way, before the pandemic, it was about 30%. That's one of the fastest growing adoptions of appliances that we've seen since the microwave oven. So if we're not leveraging this, if we're not helping consumers see how to use it with your products in your portfolio, we're missing out. Or if you just don't have instructions, if you just have the oven and the microwave oven, but you don't have the air fryer in terms of how to prepare your meals, we're missing out. Consumers bought this for the purpose of convenience. And by the way, we just updated our kitchen audit. And one of the new questions that we have is this appliance typically on the counter or not? And this is one of those appliances that has made it most of the time onto the counter. So it is front and center to consumers, and they want to see ways on how to use it. The grill is on the top. I'm going to talk a little bit in special occasions more about the grill. It has fallen, and it's kind of being more reserved for the special occasion time, but it's still very relevant for consumers in terms of those times. It's just been very hot these last few years, and people just don't want to stand over an open flame. And so, oddly enough, we saw baking do very well in the summertime. I guess people could be inside in air conditioning instead of being over an open flame. Now, I want to put it back over to Jana for just a moment. She wants to talk a little bit more about what's going on in terms of meats and how that relates to dinner, and then I'll come back and talk about some special occasions.
Yeah, and it's been great. By the way, I want to compliment everyone in the chat. What's fun about this is we have a very active Q&A box going, and Thank you all for your comments, but actually, a lot has been related, digging deeper into the protein shifts that we've seen. Now, one key point is that data really, what we're looking at here, as we alluded to earlier, is meat buying behavior has changed in the last 5 years. Now, we had a peak of pounds sold in meat during the pandemic when we were home all the time. Meat and protein, that moment in time collided with the personal feeling and really a lot of health and wellness messages around protein forward diets. So, no big surprise. I think even if we weren't homebound, meat would have seen some peak pounds happening during 2020 and 2021. Now, what we do see, as I mentioned earlier, is that the trip journey has not followed in protein the way it's followed in other foods and beverages. And as you see, when we didn't need as much meat on hand at home as we're doing just in time shopping, we're not selling as much total pounds in this new inflationary period because protein's expensive. What's been really interesting, just as Darren has shared about the motivations behind breakfast, lunch, dinner, the why and how you change your shopping because of inflation in meat and protein has also been fascinating. And shout out to our trusted and valued partner, 210 Analytics, for their amazing work that they do in their Power of series every year from a consumer survey standpoint. What we found is that meat was the place that people were making a lot of changes in 2023 and as we started 2024. How much, what kind, what cuts. When you have to rationalize why you're even in a department in the first place, every trip, you're going to see a change in behavior. But here's what was the fascinating part. I'm going to use meat as an example, but I could have a very interesting conversation about any of the other food and beverage departments as well. But in meat, the decision factors of why and how you buy look drastically different if you're younger versus older. And shout out to my friend Mark, who we've been having a great chat about Gen X being squeezed. Think about Gen X as would be the middle box of this, right? You've got Gen Zs thinking a lot about their mood, their nutrition. What's the value of this? And brand meaning a signal of quality. So a lot of Gen Zs look for attributes like grass-fed organic claims because to them it's a signal of this meat will taste better. Really interesting, right? Because honestly, in the meat industry, we sell based on quality signals, the color, the package, but price per pound and package price have been it. Gen X sits in the middle of this, right? We want to also eat protein forward diets and please our teens and Gen Z, while we're also really cognizant and trained by our boomer parents to price gap on price per pound. So I'm showing this about meat because honestly, this generational difference in motivators is huge. One other key point, I'm not going to drain these next two slides. In the sales pound data, we've seen the shift Darren talked about in terms of what's for dinner and center of plate protein. So since 2020, there has been a shift more toward core basics that people are very confident in using, like beef and chicken. And we are actually seeing pound sales shift at retail because these motivations and how they're making dinner are having an impact. Further, and I'm really not going to drain this slide, but if you're on this call from the meat and seafood community, the number one most fascinating thing that I have seen in my career has been switching, shopper switching studies. That's what this is looking at, and decomposing each protein on its growth or decline of that protein coming from new and incremental purchases, i.e. existing buyers buying more or less. Is it coming from actual switching where people stopped buying other proteins in favor of this? And I just talked this morning with some of my clients in meat as well as my fresh team. Last year was the year of chicken. This same chart looked like beef for chicken. Incremental existing buyers as well as switching from other proteins. Chicken isn't seeing so much switching. And as you see, the chicken sales are still strong. It's still making it on the plate, as Darren said. I'm not here to tell you that chicken isn't huge. It's only lost $67 million. That's it. But when it comes to other proteins, beef has had a slight resurgence, especially in the last 6 months, as people have grown tired of always serving chicken, but they're confident in beef. Beef pricing also came down, and the relevancy and that experience with beef made it an increasing option. We wanted to take this little side story before we end with special occasions because every single food and beverage becomes more rational and strategic when you understand how people are making that meal. And then you see these numbers and they make a lot more sense. So I am going to finish off by turning it over to Darren to wrap us up with the most exciting day in a consumer's life, those special occasions. So, what fascinated me and why I wanted to spend our last 6 minutes talking about it is not just because I also work on a lot of categories that are heavily tied to those special moments or treats in someone's life. We also know that during this inflationary period and coming out of COVID's really insular behavior, consumers are ready to party. 18 times per year, consumers are telling us in our national eating trends data that they consider that meal occasion a special occasion. That's a heck of a lot more than Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter, my friends. That is 6 billion occasions where people are saying, I consider this special. And let's hear more, Darren, about when they consider it a special occasion, what they're doing.
Yeah, and just to put that into context, that's a little bit more than once a month that the average person is stepping away from having their three squares, maybe the snacking occasion during the day, and celebrating something. It could be a birthday, it could just be, I want to get together with friends and family I haven't seen in a while. And these occasions look very different from some of these other occasions. And we'll see in just a second that they typically have more foods, there's more things to buy. So they're better occasions for us. There's just a lot more that consumers are buying during these time frames. And so just to put a few stats up here, and these are indices. So if it's 100, it's on par with other occasions. And so when we see something like 300, 344, that's 3 times more likely that this is going to happen. So the presence of guests, we're going to be meeting with other people. We do see that people go to restaurants a bit more often, right? The majority of it is still in the home, but it is still more likely to go away from home when we're meeting up with people, celebrating things. We do it on weekends a little bit more often because we have that time to celebrate. We've got the time to prepare, and it tends to happen a little bit later on in the day. So what we're just talking about in terms of motivations earlier in the day, it's more helpful. It's more about convenience and routine. Those tend to go out the window a little bit more when we go towards the end of the day. And so certainly during these special occasions, we see a whole slew of different needs when consumers are there. Now, we use different things to help us get through these occasions. And so things like the griddle, the oven, the grill are used much more often during these occasions. Thinking about what we could put in these different devices, we could put a lot of food at once, right? So it's really about just feeding many mouths at the same time. The griddle, by the way, has been growing lately. And part of that has to do with the fact that it's not just about burgers, it's not just about frying things, but we're seeing people put things like eggs on it, right? So there's just a lot of new ways that people could start to make things in new ways. And I know this is not just about special occasions, but one way to think about getting growth for your products is finding new ways to prepare them and finding new day parts for consumers to eat them. One big thing that we're seeing right now is cottage cheese. It's really gone from something that's just kind of this cheesy thing that we have in the morning, kind of a health halo, has protein. And if you've looked online, just go to TikTok or Instagram Reels and just put cottage cheese, you will see a lot of influencers talking about different ways to use this. And the growth has been double digit in terms of volume this year. There's definitely a direct correlation between finding new ways to use products and people eating them and therefore buying it more often. So the griddle is a perfect example of how we're seeing this. Now, the grill here, it is definitely something that we use more often during special occasions. I do want to show the overall usage in terms of the way it's been used over the past few years. It has been trending down. Now, again, people are out and about more often since the pandemic, so we just don't have the time really to make all these grilling occasions. And like I said, we've had record-breaking hot summers over the last few years, so people just don't want to be standing over a grill. So grilling has become more kind of, I don't want to say pigeonhole, but it's becoming more set towards special occasions as well. Because again, it's a device that people could use to feed a lot of people at one time. And if you've noticed, a lot of people, whenever they have these occasions, they just all say, no, I want to grill, I want to grill. It's like people actually do want to actually help out with this appliance. So it's just another way that we could think about how to get people to use these more often. And when we're using the grill, we are much more likely to use things like red meat. So we saw at dinner time, it wasn't number one, but it pops up to the top spot when we're using these in these occasions. vegetables, poultry, pork, lots of other things, and we're going to drink while we're at it. We're looking at tap water, carbonated soft drinks. What's probably not here also are adult beverages that are much more likely to happen at these occasions as well. So when we're thinking about what are the top things that we typically have at these occasions, it's a multitude of things. You see a lot of baked items here. Birthdays are a big part of that, but you also see things like pork and pizza and a whole slew of things that we could just go through when we give you the deck. So for the sake of time, let me just do a quick wrap up here. And what did we talk about today? So we know that inflation has been putting consumers under pressure to eat at home more often. And so that's forcing them to find ways to do things differently. So things like heat and eat solutions, finding more convenience in the things that they're doing. And so making sure we're helping them along that journey. And like I just said, it's these quick solutions that are helping them incorporate these meals into their more busy lives, the fact that they don't have as much time to make these items. Now, there have been some bright spots on the food service side, even though we've seen declines in traffic. We know it's about indulgence, quality, and experiences. Those are things that maybe people can't get in the home, that's still bringing them out to food service operators. And so really the key to finding growth, like I alluded to with the cottage cheese example, is finding ways to get your products into new day parts, that we didn't think of ahead of time. So if something that's traditionally a breakfast item, how can we make that a snacking item? How can we make that a dinner item as well, or a dip for a snacking occasion? How do we get that for consumers? That is a key to finding growth these days. All right, well, that brings us to the question and answer session.
Yep.
It looks like
So
we're
we
about
are
a
at
minute
time.
over.
Yeah, I know we're over. Thank you to all who are still on or those listening to the recording. I just want to give a shout out that if you have questions, we've answered almost everyone's questions in the chat. I think we learned in our digital society that sometimes going back and forth is easier. So great. There was so much great information. But quick shout out at the end of the deck. If you have a Circana representative, please reach out to them. They will all have access to this deck. They can get Darren and I or any of our colleagues and access to much more than we shared today. If you do not have a Circana rep, you can email liquiddatago@circana.com for any general needs. Or if you have specific food service, or really the bulk of the questions I got, Darren, as you might have expected, was from our consumption. So many of you I mentioned, Bridget Kraft is our key leader there. We have so much more info than we shared today in a public forum. So please reach out to Darren, myself, or those key contacts. We are so excited to continue this conversation with you all. Quick reminder, an email will be out within the next 24 to 48 hours that will include a link to the deck and the recording. Every Circana team member will also have access to it through our insider site for internal communications. Thank you so much, Darren. I was personally taking notes while I was typing chat questions. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and we look forward to your feedback about our Day in the Life series. Good luck. Go sell some food and beverages to some new consumers.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.